Hey everyone, here's part 8 of Ancient and Modern Ships. So, while referring to this invention of Bernard Renan, it should be mentioned that France rose to the rank of a great naval power in the reign of Louis the XIV, under the famous minister Colbert, in the latter half of the 17th century. When Louis succeeded to the throne, the French navy was practically non-existent, as it only consisted of 4 or 5 frigates. In 1672, he had raised the strength of the fleet to 50 line of battle ships and a corresponding number of frigates and smaller vessels. 9 years afterwards, the French marine numbered 179 vessels of all classes, exclusive of galleys. In 1690, the French fleet in the Channel alone numbered 68 ships, while the combined British and Dutch squadrons consisted of only 56 and suffered a defeat at Beachy Head, in which the English lost 1 vessel and their allies lost 6. This defeat was, however, amply revenged 2 years afterwards when the Allies succeeded in opposing the enormous number of 99 ships of the line, besides 38 frigates and fireships, to Tourville's fleet of 44 ships of the line and 13 smaller vessels, and they defeated it off the coast of Cape La Hogue, inflicting on it a loss of 15 line of the battleships, including the famous Soleil Royal of 108 guns, which is illustrated in Figure 50. From the time of Louis XIV down to the present date, French naval architects have always exercised a most important influence on the design of warships, a circumstance which was largely due to the manner in which Colbert encouraged the application of science to this branch of construction. It may be truly said that during the whole of the 18th century, the majority of the improvements introduced in the forms and proportions of vessels of the Royal Navy were copied from French prizes. In order to complete the illustrations of British warships of the latter half of the 17th century, views of a second rate are given in Figure 52 and a cross-section of a fourth rate in Figure 53. It would be impossible in the present work to notice in detail all the alterations in size and structure of ships which took place during the 18th century. A few of the leading changes may, however, be mentioned. In the year 1706, an attempt was made to systematize the dimensions of the various rates, and the figures are given in the following table. When the figures were compared with those of contemporary French ships of the same rates, it was found that the British vessels of every class were of inferior dimensions. Whenever British men of war were captured by the French, the number of their guns was reduced. It was universally admitted that the French ships were superior in sailing qualities, so much so was this the case that whenever a French squadron was chased, the English-built ships in it were the first to be overtaken. The subject of the superiority in size of the French ships was constantly coming to the front, and in 1719 a new establishment was made for the dimension of ships in our Royal Navy, according to the following scale. So they increased the length in general by around 2 feet, the breadth by around a foot to around a foot and 2 inches. And the increase of the tonnage was increased from like 15 to around 67, 59, and so on. In addition to the increase in dimensions, much improvement was made in the same year in the interior arrangements, and in the preservation of the timber of which ships were constructed. Up until this period, both thick stuff and planks were prepared by charring the inner surface, while the outer surface was kept wet, and this process was continued till a plank was brought to a fit condition for bending to the shape as it was required to take. In this year, however, the process of stoving was introduced. It consisted in placing the timber in wet sand and subjecting it to the action of heat for such a time as was necessary in order to extract the residue of the sap and to bring it to a condition of suppleness. The year 1726, the process was favorably reported on by 2 of the master shipwrights in their report on the state of the planking on the bottom of Falkland. Some of the planking had been charred by the old process, some stoved by the new. The remainder had been neither stoved nor charred. The stoved planks were found to be in a good state of preservation, and while many of the others were rotten, the process remained in use till 1736. After 1736, it was superseded by the practice of steaming the timber. The steaming and the kindred process of boiling remained in vogue during the whole of the remainder of the era of wooden shipbuilding. In 1771, the rapid decay of ships in the Royal Navy once more caused serious attention to be paid to the subject of the preservation of timber. It was in consequence arranged that larger stocks of timber should be kept in the dockyards, and that line of battle ships should stand in frame for at least a year in order to season before the planking was put on. Similarly, frigates were to stand in frame for at least 6 months, and all thick stuff and planking was to be sawn out a year before it was used and stacked, with battens between the planks so as to allow for the free circulation of the air. Similar regulations were put in force for the beam pieces, knees, and other portions of the ships. Much trouble was caused by the injurious effects of bilge water and foul air in the holds of the ships, and various remedies were devised from time to time. In 1715, structural improvements were devised to allow of the bilge water flowing more freely to the pumps, and trunks were fitted to the lower decks to convey air to the holds. In 1719, it was proposed that the holds of the ships should have several feet of water run into them in the early spring in order to cool them, and that should not be pumped out until August, but this remedy was never extensively practiced. In 1753, Dr. S. Hales proposed a system of ventilation by means of windmills and hand pumps, which produced excellent results. It was noticed that the accumulation of carbonic acid gas and foul damp air in the holds not only set up rapid decay in the ship, but also most injuriously affected the health of the crews. Dr. Hale's system was employed in the Prince from 1753 to 1798, and it is considered that the durability of this vessel had been greatly increased. It was also reported by Lord Halifax that the mortality on the non-ventilated ships on the coast of Nova Scotia was 12 times as great as those on the vessels which were fitted with Dr. Hale's appliances. There are not many records in existence of the merchant vessels of this period. Figure 54 is a representation of an armed East Indiaman which was launched at Blackwall in 1752. Her length of keel was 108 feet 9 inches, with a breadth of 34 feet and a burden of 668 tons. She was named the Falmouth and was constructed by the famous shipbuilder John Perry of Blackwall Yard. She was commenced almost exactly 2 years before the date of her launch. Like all of her class, she was heavily armed. At the close of the war against France and Spain, which lasted from 1744 to 1748, great complaints were made of the weakness of our warships at sea. It was also found that the establishment of 1719 had not been adhered to. The dimensions of ships were not fixed in accordance with any particular standard. The first defect was remedied by the placing of as many standards of wood or iron on the different decks as could conveniently be arranged, so as to not interfere with the guns, and by the use of larger bolts than had hitherto been employed, as high up as possible in the throats of the hanging knees. Also, the beams of the quarterdeck and roundhouse were supported with lodging knees, and in some instances with hanging knees of wood or iron. Various other pieces, such as the stem, were also strengthened, and the weights of the taffrails and the quarter pieces were reduced. The advice of the master shipwrights of the various dockyards was sought in order to fix a new establishment of dimensions, but great difficulties were found in introducing the much-needed reforms, and for some time afterwards the ships of the British Navy were at a disadvantage with those of foreign countries, by reason of their contracted dimensions and inferior forms. The capture, with great difficulty, of a Spanish ship of 70 guns, named the Princessa in 1740 by 3 British men of war of equal rating but far inferior dimensions, was one of the events that first opened the eyes of the Admiralty to the defects of their vessels. The first attempt towards introducing a better type of ship was made in 1746, when the Royal George, famous for her size, her services, her beauty, and misfortunes, was laid down. She was not launched till 1756. The following were her principal dimensions. The length of keel for tonnage was 143 feet, 5.5 inches. The length of the gun deck was 178 feet. The extreme breadth was 51 feet, 9.5 inches. The depth of the hold was 21 feet, 6 inches. The tonnage was 2,047, and the number of guns was 100. The crew was 750 men. Figure 55 is an illustration of this ship. She rendered great services to the country under the orders of Lord Admiral Hawke, especially in the memorable defeat of the French Navy off the coast of Belle Isle in 1759. She was lost at Spithead in 1782 when being inclined in order to have some repairs to her bottom executed. She capsized and went under, 900 men, women, and children being drowned in her. The Royal George was followed by several others of various rates and improved dimensions, notably the Blenheim, 90, and the Princess Amelia, 80. The latter was one of the most famous ships of her day and was constantly employed as long as she continued fit for service. In 1747, a French ship of 74 guns named the Invincible was captured and was found to be such an excellent vessel that her dimensions were adopted for the Thunderer, laid down about 1758. One of the most interesting models in the museum is of the Triumph 74, also built on lines of the Invincible in 1764. Her length of gun decks were 171 feet with 3 inches, a breadth of 49 feet 9 inches. The depth of the hold was 21 feet 3 inches. In the following year was built the Victory, 100 guns, famous as Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, and still afloat in Portsmouth Harbor. Her dimensions are a length of gun deck 186 feet, a breadth of 52 feet, a depth of hold at 21 feet and 6 inches, with a tonnage of 2,162. The following table gives the dimensions of typical ships of war constructed about the middle of the 18th century. So generally we see that 100 raiders, ships with 100 guns, have a length of gun deck for around 178 feet, length of keel for tonnage to be around 143 feet. Their extreme breadth is around 51 feet and 9.5 inches, and the depth of the hold is 21 feet 6 inches with a tonnage of around 2,047. And this decreases substantially as we go down the rates. So the genuine frigate, that is to say a large cruiser of relatively high speed carrying its main armament on one deck, was introduced into the Royal Navy in 1741 when the Adventure was built. She carried 32 guns, of which 22 were 12-pounders. The first British 36-gun frigates were the Brilliant and the Pallas, built in 1757. Their main armament also consisted of 12-pounders. French frigates of the same date were of larger dimensions, as is proved by the following table, which compares the principal measurements of the Brilliant and of the French frigate Aurore. In the year 1761, a most important improvement was introduced, which greatly increased the usefulness of ships. This was the discovery of the value of copper plates as a material for sheathing their bottoms. Previously to this period, lead was a metal used for sheathing purposes, and even it was only employed occasionally. In other cases, the bottoms of vessels were painted over with various compositions, the majority of which fouled rapidly. The first vessel in the Navy that was copper-sheathed was the Alarm, a 32-gun frigate. At first, the use of copper caused serious oxidation of the iron bolts employed in the bottom fastenings, and copper bolts were substituted for them. About the year 1788, the dimensions of the various rates were again increased in order to keep up with the improved French and Spanish ships. The year 1780, the 38-gun frigate founded on a French model was introduced into the Navy, and continued to be much used throughout the Great Wars at the close of the 18th and the commencement of the 19th century. The first British frigate of this rating was the Minerva, which measured 141 feet in length of gun deck, which measured 141 feet in length of the gun deck, 38 feet 10 inches, the width of the beam being around 13 feet 9 inches, with a depth of hold and at 940 tons, figures which were evidently based on those of the Aurora captured in 1758. In 1781 and 1782, two very large French frigates were captured. Their names were the Artois and the Aigle, and they exceeded in size anything in this class that had yet been built. The length of gun deck measured 158 feet, with a width of 40 feet 4 inches, a depth of hold at 13 feet 6 inches, and a tonnage of around 1,152. They each carried 42 guns and 280 men. Again, in 1790, the force of new ships of the various rates was much increased. The largest line of battleship then built was a Hibernian of 110 guns. She was the first of her class introduced into the Navy. Her dimensions were as follows: length on gun deck at 201 feet 2 inches, extreme breadth at 53 feet 1 inch, a depth of hold at 22 feet and 4 inches, and a burden in tons of 2,508. The armament consisted of 30 32-pounders in the lower deck, 30 24-pounders on the middle, and 32 18-pounders on the upper decks, while 18 12-pounders were mounted on the forecastle and quarterdeck. It is worthy of remark that for some time previously, the large line of battleships carried 42-pounders on the lower deck, but it was found that the 32-pounders could be loaded much more quickly and that a great advantage arose in consequence. In In the year 1792, the first 40-gun frigate, the Costa, was built. This type of vessel was intended to replace the old 44-gun two-decker. The Costa measured 150 feet on deck, 40 feet, 9.5 inches in extreme breadth, 14 feet 3 inches in depth of hold, with a burden of 1,142 tons. Her armament consisted of 30 18-pounders on the main deck and 10 9-pounder long guns on quarterdeck and forecastle. During the whole of our naval history, down to comparatively recent times, improvements in the dimensions and forms of our ships were only carried out after they had been originally adopted by the French or Spaniards, and more recently by the people of the United States of America. Thus we find that shortly after war had been declared against the French Revolutionary government in 1792, Admiral Hood took possession at Toulon, amongst other vessels, of a French first-rate called the Commerce de Marseille, which was larger and mounted more guns than any vessel in service of Great Britain. Figure 56 is an illustration of this fine man of war, which was 208 feet 4 inches long on the lower deck, 54 feet 9.5 inches broad, of 25 feet depth of hold, and of 2,747 tons burden. As an instance of the progress in size as related to armament made during the century, we may compare the dimensions of this French first-rate with those of the Royal Anne, an English 100-gun ship being built in 1706. The length of gun deck of the latter ship was 171 feet 9 inches, and tonnage at around 1,809, with the more recent vessel showing an increase of nearly 50% in tonnage for an increased armament of 20 guns. As further examples of the naval architecture of this period, in figures 57 and 58 are given views of an English first-rate of the year 1794, and figures 59 and 60 are corresponding to views of a heavy French frigate of about the year 1780. One of the greatest improvements made at the end of the 18th century was the raising of the lowest battery further above the water so as to enable the heavy guns to be fought in all weathers. It was frequently observed that the old British men of war of 74 guns, when engaging a hostile vessel to leeward, were on account of the crankness of the ship and the lowness of the battery, obliged to keep their lower ports closed, whereas the French ships, which were comparatively stiff and carried their lower guns well above the water, were enabled to fight with the whole of their battery in all weathers. After the capture of the Commerce de Marseille, an English first-rate named the Caledonia, to carry 120 guns, was ordered to be laid down. She was not, however, commenced till 1805. Her dimensions and proportions closely approximated to those of her French prototype, and need not therefore to be more particularly referred to. She was the first 120-gun ship built in this country. In the year 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain. The struggle was memorable for several naval duels between the frigates of the two nations. When the war broke out, the United States possessed some frigates of unusual dimensions and armament. The British cruisers were quite overmatched, and in several instances were captured. In consequence of these disasters, a new and improved class of frigate was introduced into the Royal Navy. What had happened in the case of the frigates took place also in regard to the sloops employed as cruisers. They were completely outmatched by the American vessels of corresponding class, and many of them were taken. In 1815, on the conclusion of the long wars with France, there was of course a marked diminution in the number of ships being built for the purposes of war. The Howe, of 120 guns, is given as an illustration of a first rate of this period. During the earlier years of the present century, great improvements were introduced by Sir Robert Seppings and others into the structural arrangements of ships. During the long wars, abundant experience had been gained as to the particular kind of weakness which ships exhibited when exposed to the strains produced by waves. It had been felt for many years that the system of building was very defective, and the life of a man of war was consequently short, only 15 years for a ship built of English oak in the Royal Dockyards, and of about 12 years for similar vessels built in private yards. Amongst the greatest defects was the absence of longitudinal strength to enable a ship to resist the effects of hogging and sagging strains in a seaway. Alright everyone, that is it for part 8, and I'll see you all next time.